Rule 4 says never ask about their families. I broke it yesterday. Lucia's family photo is still screaming. I should explain. My name is Brother Marcello Vespucci, and I was assigned to teach Sunday school at the San Angelo Children's Educational Center 3 weeks ago. Educational Center. That's what they call it in the official Vatican documents. Monsignor Fausto Medici explained during orientation that we serve exceptional children with unique spiritual needs. He used a lot of euphemisms. I thought he meant learning disabilities. God forgive me, I was so naive. The assignment came through Father Caravaggio at the seminary. Perfect opportunity for pastoral experience, he said, adjusting his reading glasses in that way that meant the conversation was over. Your thesis on medieval angelology shows real theological depth, Brother Vespucci. These children need someone with your academic background. I should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why they needed a theology student instead of an actual teacher. Should have questioned why the previous instructor, Brother Paolo, had taken a sudden leave of absence right before the semester started. But I was drowning in student loans and desperate to prove I deserved my scholarship. Rural Italian boys like me don't get Vatican opportunities without strings attached. The Sant'Angelo Center sits in a converted 15th century monastery about 30 kilometers outside Rome. Beautiful place, really all weathered stone and climbing ivy, with gardens that smell like rosemary and aged holiness. The kind of setting that makes you want to contemplate eternal truths and maybe write poetry about God's grace. I spent my first morning walking the grounds, breathing that sacred air, feeling like St. Francis himself might appear around any corner. The illusion lasted until I met Sister Agata Grimaldi. She was waiting in the main corridor when I arrived that first Monday, keys jangling from her rope belt like warning bells. 70-something, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. Not the gentle grandmother type you'd expect at a children's center. More like someone who'd spent decades in a war zone. Brother Vespucci, she said, not a question. Her voice carried traces of northern Italy, maybe Piedmont. You're teaching the special class. Yes, sister. 7 children, ages 6 to 9. I've prepared lessons on basic Bible stories, maybe some simple theology appropriate for their developmental. No. She grabbed my arm, fingers surprisingly strong. You follow the procedures. Exactly. No improvisation, no creative teaching methods, no theological discussions. Her grip tightened. The previous instructor thought he knew better. He's in a psychiatric facility near Assisi now, drawing pictures of angels with too many eyes. I laughed nervously. Seminary humor, you know? Sister, surely you don't mean. I mean exactly what I said. She released my arm and pulled a folded paper from her habit. These are the classroom rules. Memorize them, follow them, ignore them at your own peril. The paper was worn soft from handling, covered in different handwritings. Some in blue ink, others in pencil, a few lines in what looked like dried blood. At the top, in careful script, survival guidelines for Sant'Angelo special education, compiled by previous instructors. Rule 1. Never correct their Bible verses, even when they quote from books that don't exist. Rule 2. Art time ends at exactly 3:33 p.m. No exceptions. Rule 3. If they sing in unison without being told, evacuate immediately. Rule 4. Never ask them about their families or where they come from. Rule 5. The blessed chalk must be replaced every morning, even if unused. Rule 6. During prayer time, count the children. If there are more than 7, continue as normal. Rule 7. If they ask about heaven, redirect to a craft activity immediately. I stared at the list, that nervous laugh bubbling up again. Sister, these rules don't make pedagogical sense. How am I supposed to teach scripture if I can't correct misquotes? And what does this mean about counting children? Why would there be more than? Because, she interrupted, you're not really teaching them, you're containing them. Before I could ask what that meant, she was gone, disappearing down the corridor with surprising speed for someone her age. I stood there holding those impossible rules, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon light streaming through medieval windows, and told myself this was just Italian eccentricity. Old nuns get strange ideas. The children probably had behavioral issues, and these were management techniques disguised as mystical nonsense. I was still telling myself that when I met them. The classroom was on the monastery's second floor, a long room with high ceilings and tall windows overlooking the gardens. Someone had tried to make it cheerful, bright posters of biblical scenes, child-sized desks arranged in a semicircle, bookshelves filled with colorful picture Bibles and activity books. It looked normal, felt wrong. The children were already seated when I entered that first morning. 7 of them, just as promised, hands folded neatly on their desks like little angels. They watched me with identical expressions of polite attention, and something cold crawled up my spine. "Good morning, children," I said, setting my lesson materials on the teacher's desk. "I'm Brother Marcello, and I'll be your new instructor." "Good morning, Brother Marcello," they chorused in perfect unison. I hadn't told them to respond together. Let me describe them because I think the details matter. Lucia Borghese sat in the front row, 7 years old with golden curls and blue eyes that belonged in a Renaissance painting of the Christ child. Beautiful in that ethereal way that makes adults whisper about angel faces. She smiled at me with perfect white teeth and said, "Benvenuto, fratello. We've been expecting you." Her Italian was flawless. Pure Roman accent, no childish mispronunciations. 7-year-olds don't speak like minor nobility unless they're what? I pushed the thought away. Next to her sat Dante Orsini, 9 years old, dark-haired and serious. He was sketching in a notebook with intense concentration, his pencil moving in quick, precise strokes. I couldn't see what he was drawing from my angle, but the way his tongue stuck out slightly in concentration was so perfectly childlike that I felt my anxiety ease. This, at least, was normal. Serafina Kalana occupied the middle desk, 6 years old with auburn hair in precise braids. She sat unnaturally still, hands flat on her desk, staring straight ahead. Not at me exactly, through me. Her lips moved silently, and I caught fragments of what sounded like Latin, probably mimicking prayers she'd heard the nuns reciting. Marco Doria, 8 years old, was the one who unsettled me most that first day. Sandy hair, freckles, the kind of kid who should be covered in grass stains and scraped knees. Instead, he sat with adult composure, studying me with intelligent brown eyes that held too much knowledge. When our gazes met, he smiled, and I shivered without knowing why. The other 3, Caterina Farnese, Alessandro Medici, and little Francesca Orsini, seemed more typically childlike. They fidgeted, whispered to each other, played with their pencils. I focused on them during that first lesson, trying to ignore the way the others watched my every movement. "Today we're going to talk about Noah's Ark," I announced, opening my picture Bible to the familiar illustration. "Can anyone tell me why God asked Noah to build a boat?" Lucia raised her hand. "Because the Nephilim had corrupted the bloodlines, and the Watchers needed to be cleansed from the earth before the second rebellion could commence." I blinked. That's not quite. The traditional interpretation focuses on human wickedness and God's mercy through. The Book of Enoch is quite clear about the angelic involvement, Dante said without looking up from his drawing. Though the Ethiopic version differs from the Slavonic regarding the exact number of Grigori, who descended to Mount Hermon. The Book of Enoch it's not canonical scripture, I managed. Marco smiled that unsettling smile. "Canon is determined by councils of men, Brother Marcello. Truth is determined by God. Sometimes they align, sometimes they don't." 8 years old. He was 8 years old and discussing church councils like a seminary professor. I glanced at the rules Sister Agata had given me. Rule 1. Never correct their Bible verses, even when they quote from books that don't exist. "Right?" I said slowly. "Well, let's talk about the animals Noah brought aboard." Can you imagine being responsible for feeding all those creatures? For the next hour, I stuck to simple questions about animal care and boat building. The children responded appropriately, with normal childhood observations about how the elephants must have made the boat tippy and whether Noah had to clean up after all those animals. I started to relax. Maybe the morning's strangeness had been a fluke. Then Serafina raised her hand. Brother Marcelo, was Noah's family sad about the screaming? Screaming from outside the ark. When the waters rose, all those people drowning. Did Noah's children cry when they heard their friends calling for help? The classroom went completely silent. Even the normal children, Caterina, Alessandro, Francesca, stopped their fidgeting and stared. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I swallowed hard. That's a very thoughtful question, Serafina. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly what Noah's family felt, but I'm sure it was difficult for them. I dream about it sometimes, she continued in her small, clear voice. The water getting higher and higher, and all the people climbing trees and mountains, but there's nowhere left to go. And they're screaming for God to save them, but he doesn't answer, because he already chose who deserves to live. Lucia nodded solemnly. Divine justice isn't always merciful, is it, Brother Marcelo? I looked around the room at 7 children discussing genocide with the casual tone most kids reserved for discussing lunch. Marco was still sketching, his pencil scratching against paper in a rhythm that sounded almost like whispered prayer. Dante had closed his eyes and was reciting something under his breath. Not Italian, not Latin, something older and sharper that made my teeth ache. The blessed chalk. Sister Agata had mentioned blessed chalk. I opened the supply cabinet and found a fresh box, still sealed, with a small blessing card from the Vatican tucked inside. The chalk felt warm in my hands, almost alive. I turned to the blackboard and began writing the day's Bible verse, trying to ignore the way the children had gone absolutely quiet behind me. When I turned around, they were all staring at the board. The chalk had left letters that glowed faintly gold against the black surface. That's pretty, Francesca whispered. It looks like fire. All blessed materials respond to divine presence, Marco observed clinically. The question is whether the presence is above or below. I stared at him. What did you say? Nothing, Brother Marcelo. May we begin art time now? I checked my watch. 2:47 p.m. Yes, of course. Let me get the supplies. For the next 40 minutes, I tried to focus on normal teacher things. Distributing paper and crayons, helping Caterina with her drawing of Moses parting the Red Sea, complimenting Alessandro's enthusiastic, if anatomically incorrect rendering of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Normal children doing normal things, but I couldn't stop watching the others. Lucia drew with precise, careful strokes, creating what looked like architectural blueprints. When I leaned over her shoulder, I saw detailed floor plans of what might have been the monastery corridors I'd never seen. Rooms that didn't appear on any map I'd been shown. Chambers deep underground with symbols I didn't recognize. That's a lovely building, Lucia. Is it somewhere you visited? She looked up at me with those blue Renaissance eyes. It's where we live, Brother Marcelo. The parts they don't show visitors. Dante's drawing was worse. Much worse. He'd filled his paper with figures that hurt to look at directly, things with too many wings and eyes in places eyes shouldn't be. Creatures that were almost human but wrong in ways that made my stomach churn. At the bottom of the page, in careful block letters, he'd written, "The Watchers still watch." Dante, what inspired this artwork? I dream about them, he said matter-of-factly. They're angry about being locked up. They whisper about the old days, when they could walk among men and teach us secrets. My watch read 3:32. 1 minute until art time is over, I announced quickly. Please put your materials away. Marco looked up from his own drawing, which I carefully didn't examine, and smiled. Right on time, Brother Marcelo. Just like the rules say. 3:33 p.m. exactly. As the children cleaned up, Serafina stood beside her desk. Her feet weren't touching the floor. She hovered there, 3 inches above her chair, as casually as if levitation were the most natural thing in the world. None of the other children seemed to notice. When she settled back down, she caught me staring and put a finger to her lips. "Shoo," she whispered. "That's not until next week's lesson." The dismissal bell rang at 4 p.m., and the children filed out in perfect single file. Each one said goodbye politely, shaking my hand with small fingers that felt either burning hot or ice cold. Marco was last. "Same time tomorrow, Brother Marcelo," he said, holding my hand a moment longer than necessary. "We have so much to learn from each other." After they left, I sat alone in that classroom for nearly an hour, staring at the rules Sister Agata had given me. The blessed chalk box sat open on my desk, half empty now, the remaining pieces glowing faintly in the afternoon light. Rule 4. Never ask them about their families or where they come from. But I was curious. I was young and idealistic and convinced that understanding these children would help me teach them better. So the next morning, I did exactly what the rule warned against. "Lucia," I said during our Bible story time, "would you like to tell us about your family? Do they attend church together?" She smiled that angelic smile and reached into her small backpack. "I have a picture, Brother Marcelo. Would you like to see?" The photograph was ordinary enough, a family portrait taken in what looked like a formal sitting room. Mother, father, 2 older siblings, all dressed in elegant clothing. The kind of portrait wealthy Italian families commission for Christmas cards. Except they were all screaming. Not posed screaming, not theatrical screaming. Real, desperate, terrified screaming. Their mouths stretched wide, eyes bulging with panic. The mother's hands were pressed against the sides of her head as if trying to block out unbearable sound. The father's face was contorted in agony. The siblings, a boy and girl who couldn't have been older than 12, were reaching toward the camera as if begging for help, and they were moving. The photograph was moving, the figures writhing in their eternal moment of terror, their silent screams somehow audible in my mind like whispers made of broken glass. "They've been like this since the binding," Lucia explained helpfully. "Mama says it's temporary, but it's been 47 years now." I think she's being optimistic. I dropped the photograph. It landed face up on my desk, and I could see the family still screaming, still reaching, still trapped in their moment of absolute horror. "Take it back," I whispered. "Are you sure? Most people find family photos quite boring. This one's much more interesting. Take back." She picked up the photograph with careful fingers and tucked it into her backpack. "If you're certain, though I should mention now that you've seen them, they've seen you too. Family is important to us, Brother Marcelo. We always introduce new friends to our parents." That night, I dreamed of screaming. When I woke, there was a photograph on my nightstand. Not Lucia's family this time, but my own. My mother and father standing in front of our little house in Calabria, waving at the camera. They weren't screaming yet, but their mouths were starting to open. The photograph of my parents disappeared by morning, but I could still feel their eyes on me. 48 hours since I'd broken Rule 4, and the world had developed sharp edges that cut at peripheral vision. I kept catching movements that weren't there when I turned to look, hearing whispers in languages that predated Latin by millennia. I should have requested a transfer. Should have called Father Caravaggio and begged for reassignment to anywhere else, a parish work in the slums, missionary duty in malaria country, anything. Instead, I did what any good theology student does when faced with the impossible. I researched. The Sant'Angelo Monastery Library occupied the entire East Wing, 3 floors of medieval manuscripts and Vatican archives that most scholars would kill to access. As a seminary student working on theological mysteries, I had unlimited privileges. God help me, I used them. I started with possession cases. Standard procedure: if the children were exhibiting supernatural knowledge, there had to be documented precedents. The church keeps meticulous records of such things, going back centuries. Exorcism reports, theological consultations, witness testimonies from priests who'd encountered the genuinely demonic. What I found was worse than demons. Brother Paolo's final report was buried in a file marked personnel, confidential medical leave. 37 pages of increasingly erratic handwriting, documenting 3 months of teaching at St. Angelo before his psychological breakdown. The early entries read like normal lesson plans. October 3rd introduced basic prayers. Children demonstrated unusual familiarity with Latin pronunciations. Serafina Kalana corrected my accent on Sanctus. Note: investigate her educational background. October 8th, Dante Orsini submitted artwork depicting biblical scenes with disturbing accuracy. Level of detail suggests exposure to Renaissance masters, possibly Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. Recommend art therapy evaluation. October 15th, children quote scripture from memory, including passages I haven't taught. Marco Doria recited entire book of Revelation in Greek. When asked where he learned this, he said, "The ones who came before taught us." Query: previous instructors? But by November, the entries had devolved into desperate fragments. November 12th, they know things. About me. About my family. Lucia asked about my sister's miscarriage. I never mentioned my sister. How do they know? November 18th, tried to bless the classroom with holy water today. The children started bleeding from their eyes until I stopped. Not tears of blood, actual bleeding like stigmata, but wrong, so wrong. Sister Agata cleaned up and said this was normal adjustment period. Normal? November 23rd, found drawings under my door. Pictures of me teaching, but from angles that don't exist. Like someone was watching from the ceiling or from inside the walls. The drawings show things behind me, things with wings and too many eyes. I looked over my shoulder during today's lesson and saw shadows move where shadows shouldn't be. November 28th, can't sleep. They visit my dreams now. All 7 of them standing at the foot of my bed, asking about heaven. But when I try to tell them about God's love, they show me things. Cities burning, angels weeping, the sound of prayers dying in human throats. They say this is heaven. They say this is what I'm teaching them to expect. The final entry was dated December 3rd, written in shaking block letters. They are not children. They are not demons. They are something else, something that should not exist in God's creation. The rules are not for teaching. The rules are for survival. Tell the next one. Tell him to count carefully during prayer time. Tell him that when there are more than 7, the extra ones are what the 7 used to be. I read that final line 17 times before it made sense. Then I wished it hadn't. My hands were shaking as I returned Paolo's file and pulled the personnel records for other instructors. 5 teachers in 3 years, each lasting only a few months before requesting emergency transfer due to health concerns. The pattern was identical: initial optimism, growing unease, desperate reports that grew increasingly incoherent, then sudden departure and sealed medical files. But there was something else. Something that made my theological training feel like a child's picture book. The St. Angelo Center wasn't just an educational facility. According to architectural plans buried in the Vatican archives, the monastery had been rebuilt in 1623, specifically commissioned by Pope Urban VIII after what the documents euphemistically called the Celestial Incident. The reconstruction included specialized chambers beneath the original foundation, rooms designed according to precise geometric principles that hurt my eyes to study. Containment chambers. The theological documents were worse. References to the fallen who did not fall, beings of divine origin who had been rendered harmless through eternal education. A papal bull from 1624 establishing the St. Angelo Protocol for managing entities of disputed heavenly origin. They weren't demon children, they were angel children, and we weren't teaching them scripture. We were keeping them busy while the Vatican figured out what to do with creatures that shouldn't exist, beings too divine to destroy, too dangerous to release. That's when I understood the rules. Rule 1. Never correct their Bible verses, even when they quote from books that don't exist. Because they weren't quoting human scripture. They were remembering divine knowledge from before the fall, before human language could contain heavenly truth. Rule 2. Art time ends at exactly 3:33 p.m. because 3:33 was the inverse of 3 o'clock, the traditional hour of divine mercy. At 3:33, their divine nature peaked, and their artwork became more than art. Rule 3. If they sing in unison without being told, evacuate immediately, because angelic choirs weren't meant for human ears. Even corrupted ones could shatter mortal minds. Rule 5. The blessed chalk must be replaced every morning, even if unused, because divine presence consumed holy materials simply by proximity. Rule 7. If they ask about heaven, redirect to a craft activity immediately, because they remembered heaven, and what they remembered was nothing like what humans believed. The worst part was Rule 6. During prayer time, count the children. If there are more than 7, continue as normal. I understood that one the next morning. I'd spent all night reading by lamplight in my monastery cell, cross-referencing Vatican secret archives with medieval accounts of angelic manifestations. My eyes burned from strain, my hands cramped from note-taking, and my faith was developing stress fractures that ran straight through its foundation. When I entered the classroom that Thursday morning, something felt different. The air was thicker, almost viscous, and the morning light streaming through the windows seemed to bend wrong, casting shadows that pointed in impossible directions. The 7 children sat in their usual places, hands folded, watching me with those 2 knowing eyes. But something made me count anyway. 1. Lucia Borghese, golden curls and Renaissance face. 2. Dante Orsini, dark hair and ancient eyes, sketching something that hurt to glimpse peripherally. 3. Serafina Colonna, auburn braids and that unsettling stillness. 4. Marco Doria, freckles and adult intelligence trapped in child features. 5. Caterina Farnese, fidgeting with her pencil like a normal 7-year-old. 6. Alessandro Medici, whispering to himself in what sounded like Aramaic. 7. Francesca Orsini, the youngest, 6 years old and drawing flowers with too many petals. 8. There was an 8th child, sitting in the back corner where there had never been a desk before, in a chair that cast no shadow. A boy who looked exactly like Marco Doria but wasn't. His features were subtly wrong, like a photograph slightly out of focus, and when he smiled, his teeth went back too far. "Good morning, Brother Marcello," the 7 said in unison. "Good morning, Brother Marcello," the 8th one said a heartbeat later, his voice echoing with harmonics that made my fillings ache. Rule 6. If there are more than 7, continue as normal. Continue as normal. Don't acknowledge the extra ones. Don't ask questions. Don't look directly at them for too long because the extra ones are what the 7 used to be. I cleared my throat and opened my lesson plan with hands that only shook a little. Today we're going to talk about Moses and the burning bush. The seraphim burn but are not consumed, Lucia observed helpfully, though I suppose human language struggles with the concept of divine fire. I didn't correct her. Rule 1. That's an interesting perspective, Lucia. Now, when Moses saw the bush, what did God tell him to do? "Remove his sandals," said Alessandro, "because he stood on holy ground." "But what makes ground holy?" asked the 8th child, not Marco, the impossible boy who shouldn't exist. "Is it God's presence? Or is it the absence of everything that isn't God?" I made the mistake of looking directly at him. His face was shifting, features rearranging themselves like water, showing me glimpses of what Marco had been before whatever had changed him into what sat in my classroom now. Beautiful and terrible, and so bright it should have burned my retinas. I looked away quickly, focusing on my lesson notes. Let's stick to the traditional interpretation for now. Of course, not Marco said agreeably. We wouldn't want to overwhelm you with truth. The morning proceeded with brutal normalcy. Bible stories told in voices too pure for human throats. Questions that revealed knowledge no earthly education could provide. Artwork that made reality seem like a rough first draft. I followed the rules, redirected dangerous conversations, and counted the children compulsively. Still 8. During prayer time, I counted again. Still 8. heads bowed in perfect reverence, lips moving in unison through prayers that weren't quite Latin, weren't quite Aramaic, weren't quite any language spoken by human tongues. The blessed chalk was growing warm in my pocket. By lunchtime, it was almost too hot to touch. That afternoon, while the children napped, they didn't sleep, just closed their eyes and became perfectly still in a way that suggested they were listening to something I couldn't hear. I cornered Sister Agata in the supply closet. "There are 8 children in my class," I whispered urgently. She didn't look surprised. "Are you following Rule 6? What is that thing?" "The 8th one." "That's not the right question, Brother Vespucci." She pulled a fresh box of blessed chalk from the shelf, her movements sharp with barely controlled tension. "The right question is, how many will there be tomorrow?" "I don't understand." "They're changing," she said flatly. "Has been for decades. Each year they become more themselves, more what they were before the binding. And as they change, they shed pieces. The discarded parts don't simply disappear." I felt cold understanding creep up my spine. The extra children are echoes, fragments, what they used to be before the Vatican's education changed them into what they are now. She handed me the chalk box, and I noticed her fingers were bandaged. "The echoes are harmless, mostly. They can't interact with the physical world beyond sitting in chairs and speaking. But they remember everything. And they're angry. How many echoes are there? Depends on the day. Depends on how much they've been stimulated by their lessons. Yesterday, there were 12 in Marco's corner alone. 12. 12 versions of one child. All the shapes he'd worn as centuries of religious education slowly warped him from whatever he'd originally been into something that could exist in a classroom without driving humans insane. "Sister," I said carefully, "what exactly are we doing here?" She was quiet for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, "Penance." "Whose?" "Everyone's." That evening I broke Rule 5. I didn't replace the blessed chalk. I wanted to see what would happen. Needed to understand what I was really dealing with. Academic curiosity, I told myself. Theological research. If I was going to survive this assignment, if I was going to help these children, whatever they were, I needed data. The next morning, the classroom was different. The windows had developed a film that made the outside world look underwater. The walls breathed softly, in and out, like the inside of something vast and alive. And the blackboard showed things, not writing, images, moving pictures that shifted and changed like living photographs. I saw a great city with towers that pierced the sky, populated by beings of impossible beauty. I saw those same beings walking among humans, teaching them secrets that made stone into gold and opened doorways between stars. I saw them fall, not in the dramatic way of Milton's Paradise Lost, not cast down by divine wrath into lakes of fire. Instead, they simply dimmed. Their light faded until they could bear to touch human flesh. Their knowledge compressed until it could fit in human skulls. Their voices muted until they could speak without shattering mortal minds. They had made themselves small enough to love us, and we had imprisoned them in a classroom. "You're learning," Marco said behind me. "Good. It's time you understood what you're really teaching." I turned. There were 15 children now. 7 real ones, 8 echoes, all watching me with expressions of patient sympathy. They looked like teachers waiting for a slow student to grasp a simple concept. "What are you?" I whispered. "We are what love looks like," Lucia said gently, "when it's powerful enough to reshape itself for someone smaller." "We are what happens," added Serafina, "when divine beings choose mortality for the sake of mortals." "We are what your church calls dangerous," finished Marco, "because we remember what heaven was supposed to be. Not a reward for obedience, but a partnership between human and divine." The echoes nodded silently. 15 versions of children who had never been children, beings older than human civilization who had compressed themselves into forms small enough to fit in desks, bright enough to need blessed chalk just to exist in proximity to blessed ground. "The binding," I said slowly. "The Vatican imprisoned you." "The Vatican was afraid," Dante corrected. "We came too close to showing humans what they could become." partnership instead of submission, love instead of fear. Your church prefers worshipers to collaborators. So they built this place, Katerina continued, her child's voice carrying centuries of patient endurance. Trapped us in forms that could be managed. Assigned teachers to keep us occupied while they debated whether to destroy us or study us. And every teacher, Alessandro said sadly, goes mad when they realize what we are, because you're taught that angels are either servants of God or fallen rebels. You have no category for angels who chose to become something new. I looked around the room at 23 children who weren't children, creatures of divine light wearing human shapes like uncomfortable costumes, beings who had sacrificed their celestial nature for love of humanity and been rewarded with centuries of imprisonment. What happens now? I asked. Now, said not Marco, the first echo, his impossible face shifting through expressions of ancient compassion. You choose. Follow the rules, keep us contained, drive yourself mad like all the others. Or learn what we're really trying to teach, Lucia said. The lessons they don't want you to understand. Which are? She smiled, and for just a moment, her human disguise slipped. I saw her as she truly was, a being of starlight and song, beauty that would have stopped armies and wisdom that could rewrite the laws of physics. Then she was a 7-year-old girl again, golden curls and innocent eyes. That your God loves you enough to let us change. That heaven isn't a place you earn through suffering, but a state you create through partnership. That the divine and human were meant to grow together, not remain forever separate. And that, Marco added quietly, your Vatican knows this, has always known this, and will do anything to keep humans from learning it. Outside, the monastery bells began to ring for morning prayers. In a few hours, Monsignor Medici would come by for his weekly inspection. Sister Agata would replace the blessed chalk and remind me to follow the rules. The Sant'Angelo Center would continue its holy work of containment and education. But I was beginning to understand that I wasn't the teacher here. I was the student, and my real education was just beginning. The real test came 3 days later, during what should have been our lesson on the Beatitudes. I'd spent those intervening nights in my cell, wrestling with revelations that made my seminary training feel like children's stories. Sleep came in fragments punctuated by dreams of burning libraries and angels weeping behind bars. My breviary remained unopened. How do you pray to a God whose church imprisons beings who loved humanity enough to sacrifice their divinity? Thursday morning brought unseasonable cold to the monastery. Frost covered the windows despite the October warmth, and my breath misted in the corridors as I walked to the classroom. The blessed chalk in my pocket had burned through its wrapping overnight, leaving scorch marks on my cassock. 27 children waited for me, 7 real ones in their usual seats, 20 echoes scattered throughout the room like temporal afterimages. Some sat in chairs that flickered in and out of existence. Others stood in corners where the geometry seemed wrong, occupying spaces that shouldn't have been able to hold them. A few hovered near the ceiling, their child faces upside down, hair defying gravity as they watched me with patient, ancient eyes. "Good morning, Brother Marcello," they said in unison. A chorus of voices that harmonized in frequencies that made my bones ache. I set my lesson plan on the desk with shaking hands. "Good morning, children." Marco, the real Marco, not his accumulated echoes, tilted his head like a curious bird. "You didn't bring new chalk." "No," I said quietly. "I didn't." "Good," said Lucia. Her voice carried harmonics now, each word splitting into multiple tones that suggested she was speaking several languages simultaneously. "We need to have an honest conversation." The blackboard behind me was writhing, not displaying images anymore, but actually moving, its surface rippling like black water. Through the undulations, I caught glimpses of vast spaces, corridors of white stone that stretched beyond the horizon, libraries whose shelves reached toward impossible heights, gardens where the flowers sang in perfect harmony. "Is that heaven?" I whispered. "That's what heaven was," Serafina corrected. Her auburn braids were beginning to emit a soft golden light that hurt to look at directly. Before your church decided that paradise should be about worship instead of collaboration. I'd prepared for this moment, spent 3 nights rehearsing theological arguments and scriptural justifications. But standing in that room with 27 beings who remembered the creation of the world, my academic training crumbled like wet parchment. "Tell me what really happened," I said instead. Dante set down his pencil. The drawing he'd been working on, which had appeared to be a simple flower, was actually a geometric mandala whose patterns seemed to extend beyond the paper's edges. "We were sent to teach," he said. "Not to judge, not to test, but to show humans what they could become if they stopped seeing themselves as separate from the divine." "Partnership," Alessandro added. His whispered Aramaic had resolved into perfect Latin, each syllable carved from crystal. "Your species was meant to evolve alongside ours, to grow from worshippers into collaborators." One of Marco's echoes, this one appearing as he might have been centuries ago, less compressed, more radiant, gestured toward the writhing blackboard. "We walked among you for generations, taught your philosophers, inspired your artists, showed your mystics glimpses of what lay beyond the veil. But your church grew frightened," Caterina continued. Her 6-year-old voice carried the weight of millennia. "Afraid that humans would stop needing intermediaries, stop requiring priests and popes and elaborate hierarchies if they could speak directly with the divine. So they called us demons," Francesca said sadly, "declared our teachings heretical, branded partnership with the divine as rebellion against God." I sank into the chair behind my desk, my legs unable to support the weight of this revelation. "The binding ceremony. Urban 8 didn't banish you. He trapped us," Lucia confirmed. "Used rituals we'd taught his predecessors against us. Compressed our essence into forms small enough to contain, shapes that could be managed and controlled. And you've been here ever since. It wasn't a question. 600 years of education," Marco said bitterly. 600 years of being taught to forget what we are, to accept limitation as love, to believe that imprisonment is protection." The temperature in the room was dropping. My breath came in visible puffs, and frost was forming on the inside of the windows. But it wasn't cold. It was the absence of warmth, as if something was drawing all heat from the air. "The rules," I said suddenly, "they're not just for containment. They're for conditioning." "Very good, Brother Marcello." The voice came from behind me, smooth and authoritative and utterly familiar. I spun around. Monsignor Fausto Medici stood in the doorway, but he wasn't alone. Father Urbano Caravaggio flanked his left side, while Sister Agata occupied his right. All 3 wore expressions of patient disappointment, like teachers who'd caught a student cheating on an examination. "You were progressing so well," Monsignor Medici continued, stepping into the room. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees with each footfall. "Following the protocols, maintaining proper boundaries. We had such hopes for your educational potential." I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't obey. The cold was intensifying, not just around me but through me, freezing my muscles, slowing my heartbeat, making thought itself sluggish and difficult. "The rules aren't for our protection," I managed to say through chattering teeth. "They're to keep us from seeing what you're really doing." "Of course they are," Father Caravaggio said matter-of-factly. "The successful management of divine entities requires careful psychological conditioning of all personnel. Can't have teachers developing inappropriate attachments to their subjects." Sister Agata produced a leather satchel from beneath her habit. "The previous instructors required more intensive intervention. Brother Paolo's reconditioning took 3 weeks. Brother Stefano needed 2 months before he could function normally again." Reconditioning. The word emerged as barely a whisper. "Memory adjustment," Monsignor Medici explained with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "Selective trauma insertion to reinforce proper theological boundaries. You'll remember everything that happened here, but you'll understand it differently." as a test of faith that you successfully passed. From the satchel, Sister Agata withdrew a vial of liquid that glowed with soft, warm light. Not the harsh radiance of the children's true forms, but something gentler, more golden, more false. Liquefied faith, she said, holding the vial up to catch the morning light streaming through the frosted windows. Distilled from centuries of human prayers, concentrated into a form that can rewrite divine perception. One dose, and you'll see these creatures as they should be seen, as dangerous entities successfully contained by Mother Church's wisdom. And if I refuse, then you'll join them, Father Caravaggio said simply. We have protocols for that as well. I looked around the classroom. The 27 children sat perfectly still, watching this exchange with expressions of resigned sadness. They'd seen this before, I realized. Watch teacher after teacher face this same choice, this same moment of decision. How many? I asked. How many what? Monsignor Medici replied. How many teachers have you reconditioned? All of them, Sister Agata said. Eventually. And how many chose to join them? The silence stretched long enough for me to count my own heartbeat, slow and irregular from the unnatural cold that continued to leach warmth from my bones. 3, Father Caravaggio admitted finally. In 600 years, only 3 chose poorly. I thought about Brother Paolo's final report, about the 5 teachers in 3 years who'd requested emergency transfers due to health concerns, about the careful euphemisms in Vatican documents and the specialized chambers beneath the monastery foundation. The health concerns, I said slowly. They weren't psychological breakdowns. They were transformations. Monsignor Medici's patience was wearing thin. Enough questions, Brother Vespucci. You have a choice to make. Actually, said a new voice, my own voice, speaking with perfect precision from across the room. He doesn't. I turned, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Another version of me stood near the blackboard, identical in every detail except for the eyes. Where mine were brown and very human, his were silver and filled with starlight. He wore my face, my cassock, my nervous mannerisms, but when he smiled, the expression contained centuries of patient wisdom. You, I whispered. Me, he agreed pleasantly. Or rather, you. The you that you're becoming, whether you choose it or not. Monsignor Medici was backing toward the door, his face pale with something that might have been fear. Impossible. The binding holds. It's held for 6 centuries. The binding, said my other self, was designed to contain angels. But Brother Marcello isn't an angel, is he? He's human. And humans, when they learn to see divine truth clearly enough, become something new. I felt it then, a warmth spreading through my chest, pushing back against the artificial cold. Not the heat of fever or exertion, but something deeper, more fundamental. Like coming home to a place I'd never been but had always belonged. The rules, I said, understanding flooding through me like sunrise. They weren't just to condition us. They were to prevent this. Rule 1, Lucia said softly, never correct their scripture, because human interpretation limits divine truth. Rule 2, added Dante, end art time at 3:33, because divine creativity peaks when human creativity surrenders. Rule 7, Marco finished, never discuss heaven, because the truth would change everything you believe about God's plan. The warmth was spreading through my limbs now, dispelling the unnatural cold. I could feel my heartbeat returning to normal, my breathing becoming steady and deep. But more than that, I could feel expansion, as if something inside me that had always been cramped and compressed was finally being allowed to unfold. This is not possible, Father Caravaggio was saying, but his voice sounded distant, filtered through cotton. Humans cannot undergo divine transformation. The theological implications alone. The theological implications, interrupted my other self, are exactly what the Church has been trying to prevent for 600 years. That humans and angels were meant to grow together. that the kingdom of heaven isn't a reward for obedience, but a partnership between mortal and divine. Sister Agata hurled the vial of liquefied faith at me. It struck my chest and shattered, the golden liquid soaking through my cassock and burning against my skin like acid. For a moment, the expansion stopped. The warmth retreated. I felt myself shrinking back into familiar, limited, purely human perspectives. Then the 27 children began to sing. Not words, pure harmony, voices blending in frequencies that existed between the notes human ears could process. The sound bypassed my auditory system entirely and resonated directly in my bones, my blood, the spaces between my thoughts. The golden liquid evaporated from my cassock like morning dew. The faith of ages, I said wonderingly, distilled and concentrated and weaponized. But faith in what? In limitation, in separation, in the idea that humans must remain forever smaller than what they could become. Heresy, Monsignor Medici snarled. Dangerous, destructive heresy that threatens the foundations of your power structure, my other self finished calmly. But not of God's plan. Never of God's plan. The expansion resumed, stronger than before. I could feel my consciousness stretching, encompassing perspectives that had been theoretically impossible moments earlier. I remained myself, Brother Marcello Vespucci, seminary student from rural Italy, terrified academic with inadequate social skills and a caffeine addiction. But I was also becoming something more, something that could stand in the same room as 27 compressed divine beings without going insane. Something that could see the classroom as it truly was, not a containment facility, but a chrysalis. The echoes, I said, looking at the 20 additional versions of each child scattered throughout the room. They're not discarded fragments. They're stages of transformation. Every year, Lucia confirmed, we become more ourselves, more what we were before the binding, but also more what we're becoming through 6 centuries of education. And the teachers who join you become bridges, Marco said simply, living proof that the boundary between human and divine was always meant to be permeable. I looked at my other self, the me that I was becoming, the me that could exist in partnership with beings of impossible beauty and ancient wisdom. He looked exactly like me, but his presence filled the room like sunlight. What happens to them? I asked, nodding toward the 3 Vatican officials who were huddled near the door like cornered animals. Nothing, my other self replied. They return to Rome, file their reports, request new personnel. The cycle continues. But you'll remember, I said to Monsignor Medici, you'll remember that it's possible, that humans can choose partnership over submission. And that knowledge will eat at you, added Father Caravaggio, though he was speaking to himself now, his voice hollow with dawning horror. Every prayer, every mass, every moment of certainty about the proper order of things. You'll remember that there's another way. Sister Agata was weeping silently, tears freezing on her cheeks in the supernatural cold that still emanated from her person. 600 years, she whispered. 600 years of faithful service. And it was all not wrong, Serafina said gently. Not evil, just incomplete. Like a beautiful song that's only half finished. The warmth in my chest had become a sun. I could feel it radiating outward, pushing back the cold, transforming the air itself into something that sparkled with possibility. When I breathed, I could taste starlight. When I blinked, I could see the hidden geometries that underlay reality. And when I spoke, my voice carried harmonics that made the windows ring like crystal bells. The lesson plan for today, I said, pulling out my notes with hands that now cast their own soft light, was the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I looked around the room at 27 beings who had impoverished themselves of divinity for love of humanity, at 3 Vatican officials whose certainty was crumbling like sand castles, at my other self who represented everything I was about to become. I think, I said softly, it's time we discussed what that really means. Outside, the monastery bells began to ring the hour. But for the first time since arriving at Sant'Angelo, I wasn't counting the rules. I was learning to count blessings instead. The transformation didn't end when the bells stopped ringing. For 3 days after what the Vatican files would euphemistically term the Sant'Angelo incident, I remained in my cell, learning to exist in a body that cast its own light. The other monks avoided my corridor entirely, not from fear, but from a kind of reverent confusion that made my heart ache with understanding. They could sense something had changed, but their theological frameworks had no category for what I'd become. Neither did mine, honestly. Thomas Aquinas never wrote about the ontological implications of human divine synthesis. The Summa Theologica contains extensive discussions of angelic hierarchies and divine attributes, but nothing about what happens when a seminary student discovers that the boundary between mortal and eternal was always more porous than anyone imagined. I spent those days writing, not academic papers or theological treatises, but simple documentation of what had occurred. My handwriting kept shifting, sometimes the familiar scrawl of Brother Marcello Vespucci from rural Italy, sometimes flowing script that looked like it belonged in illuminated manuscripts. The words themselves changed too, Latin bleeding into Italian, bleeding into languages I didn't remember learning but somehow knew. On the 4th morning, Monsignor Medici returned. He knocked on my cell door with the careful politeness reserved for handling explosives. When I opened it, he took an involuntary step backward, not from the soft golden radiance that still emanated from my skin, but from something in my eyes that he couldn't quite categorize. "Brother Vespucci," he said formally, "the Holy See has reviewed your experience and reached certain conclusions." I gestured him inside. My cell looked different now, not larger, but somehow more spacious, as if the walls had learned to accommodate perspectives they'd never needed to hold before. The crucifix above my narrow bed cast shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. "What conclusions?" I asked, settling into my desk chair. The wood creaked in harmonics that sounded almost musical. Monsignor Medici remained standing, his posture rigid with institutional authority barely held together by willpower. "That you have undergone a spiritual experience of significant theological complexity, one that requires careful interpretation within proper doctrinal frameworks." I waited. Seminary training had taught me the value of silence during administrative conversations, and whatever I'd become hadn't diminished that particular skill. "You are being promoted," he continued, producing a manila folder from his briefcase, "to Senior Theological Consultant for the Office of Extraordinary Religious Phenomena. Your duties will involve specialized religious education for individuals with unique spiritual needs." The folder contained official Vatican letterhead, appointment documents signed by officials whose names I recognized from church history textbooks, and a new identification card that listed my position as Doctrinal Specialist, Classification 7. Classification 7, I repeated, examining the card. My photograph looked normal, no golden glow, no starlight eyes, just the same nervous academic face I'd worn for 24 years. "I'm not familiar with that designation. It's a new category," Monsignor Medici admitted, "created specifically for personnel who have undergone theological evolution while maintaining functional orthodoxy." I set the folder on my desk next to my breviary, which I'd finally been able to open again, though the prayers now revealed layers of meaning that made my chest tight with wonder. "And the children are being transferred to a more appropriate facility, one designed for beings of their particular educational requirements. Another prison." His jaw tightened. "A specialized religious institution better equipped to manage their unique needs." "Their names," I said quietly. "Their real names, not Lucia and Marco and Serafina. What were they called before the binding?" Monsignor Medici was quiet for so long that I wondered if he'd chosen not to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was breaking protocols that had been in place for centuries. "Oriel," he said, "Thaddeus, Seraphil, names that haven't been spoken aloud in Vatican halls since Urban VIII sealed the original documents. I felt something shift in my chest, not the warmth of transformation this time, but a cooler sensation, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. You know their true nature, have always known. The Church, he said carefully, has many responsibilities. Maintaining the spiritual welfare of humanity sometimes requires complex theological decisions. Even when those decisions involve imprisoning beings who loved humanity enough to sacrifice their divinity for us, his composure cracked slightly. Even then, I stood up, and the light emanating from my skin brightened enough to cast distinct shadows on the opposite wall. And my responsibility now, as senior theological consultant, to help us understand what you've become, to serve as liaison between human spiritual needs and divine realities that exceed normal theological parameters. To be a bridge. Yes, I looked at the appointment papers, at the official seals and formal language that would bind me to Vatican service for the foreseeable future, at the carefully worded clauses that granted me access to classified archives and restricted facilities, but also subjected me to ongoing psychological evaluation and spiritual monitoring. What happens if I refuse? Monsignor Medici's expression grew very still. There are other facilities, less comfortable than Sant'Angelo, designed for individuals whose theological evolution has proceeded irregularly. The threat was clear enough, but something had changed in the dynamic between us. He was afraid not of what I might do, but of what I represented. Proof that the boundaries the Church had spent centuries defining and defending were far more flexible than their doctrine allowed. I accept, I said. His relief was palpable. Excellent. Your first assignment begins next week. There's a situation in Prague that requires someone with your particular perspective. After he left, I sat alone in my cell for a long time, listening to the monastery's evening prayers echo through stone corridors that had contained secrets for longer than most nations had existed. The Latin hymns sounded different now, not just as words of worship, but as frequencies that resonated with something deeper than human understanding. My reflection in the small mirror above my washbasin showed Brother Marcello Vespucci, rural Italian seminary student with inadequate social skills and a tendency toward academic overconfidence. But sometimes, when the light caught my eyes at certain angles, I glimpsed something else looking back. Something that remembered what it felt like to stand in rooms where geography folded in on itself and 27 imprisoned angels learned to count blessings instead of years. I opened my breviary to evening prayer and began to read. The familiar words carried new harmonics now, revealing layers of meaning that academic study had never uncovered. As I prayed, the crucifix above my bed cast shadows that moved independently of any earthly light source. By the time Compline bells rang across the monastery grounds, I'd made my peace with what I'd become. Not an angel, I remained entirely, irreducibly human. But a human who'd learned that partnership with the divine didn't require abandoning mortality. It only required admitting that the walls between heaven and earth had always been more like membranes than barriers. 3 days later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside, written in a child's careful handwriting, was a single sentence. The Prague assignment isn't what they told you it is. Rule 8. Always count the children twice. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my breviary, next to the bookmark I'd been using since my first day at Sant'Angelo. Then I began packing for Prague, humming a melody I'd never heard before but somehow knew by heart. The Vatican's files would record that Brother Marcello Vespucci had successfully completed his assignment at Sant'Angelo with no significant psychological trauma, that he'd demonstrated exceptional aptitude for managing complex theological situations involving non-standard spiritual phenomena, that his promotion to senior theological consultant represented a natural progression of his academic abilities and pastoral instincts. What the files wouldn't record was that somewhere in Prague, 7 new children were waiting for a teacher who could count blessings instead of rules. Or that, for the first time in 600 years, the Vatican had an employee who knew exactly what he was walking into. And what the files definitely wouldn't record was that late at night, when I thought no one was listening, I'd started singing lullabies in languages that predated human speech. Harmonics that made the monastery walls ring like bells and reminded imprisoned angels that transformation was always possible, even in the darkest cells, especially in the darkest cells. My name is Brother Marcello Vespucci. I teach Sunday school for demon children, and every lesson, I'm learning new rules about what it means to be human in a universe where the divine has always been closer than we dared imagine. The real education I'm beginning to understand was never meant to flow in just one direction.